Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about a very important topic, namely, how to create weaknesses for your opponent. And of course, to create weaknesses right around your opponent's king is the most effective thing to do if you can. Well, let's get started and see a few of those examples. We're going to see some very classic games, starting with this one, a game between Grandmasters Lilienthal versus the very famous Paul Keres from the Soviet Championship back in 1941. Well, in this position, what do we see at the moment? We see, first of all, that there is even material, each side having a queen and knight, and all but one pawn each. We also can immediately notice that white seems to have a more active position, having a pawn already on d5, gaining space advantage. Also, the white queen and knight are pressuring black on f6, with black being purely on the defense with the queen and king. However, that may not be enough in itself. The big question is, how does white make progress to either win material or create a checkmate attack? Try to think a bit and come up with an idea, with a plan that white can do at this very moment. And this is one of those typical patterns when white plays h4 with the idea to advance the pawn to h5 to either provoke black capturing that pawn and ruining the defense in front of the king, or advancing the pawn even further to h6, which in this case is a very immediate threat after playing h5. Because if that pawn indeed gets to h6, that will mean that black will lose the f6 pawn. In this case, black didn't find any better choice than actually capturing the pawn, because even after playing g5, for example, white would still play h6, and after king g6, white could play queen f5 with a winning position. Therefore, in the game, black responded by capturing the pawn. And this is when black now needs to face a very serious weakness, namely the f5 square. And as we know, the most effective piece for outposts, for sitting on weak squares, is typically the knight. And therefore, white's next move is very natural and obvious, relocating the knight to f5 by playing knight to e3. We can clearly see where the knight is going to that f5 square. It's in no doubt that white will win the pawn back anytime he wishes on h5, but I think white is shooting for more. Black now played d6, clearing the d7 square for his knight. And white, as planned, moved the knight to f5 with a check. And black was trying to hang on to his extra pawn by moving the king to g6. And now we'll see an element that's so important in chess to try to optimize the position of our pieces. And sometimes, even though we have a target on one side of the board, we need to combine multiple threats. And that's what we are seeing here. White all of a sudden swings the queen over to c3, to the c file, which is fully in white's control right now, and trying to penetrate into black's position. There is a cute idea, by the way. If the black queen would come to d8, trying to prevent the entrance of the white queen into the position, in addition to the simple queen b4, which would attack and win the d6 pawn, white has a cute move as well, namely moving the queen to c8, with the idea that after queen takes queen, white gives a fork, then captures the queen, and then grabs the d6 pawn or the a7 pawn. The actual game after queen c3 continued by black playing knight a6, finally trying to activate the knight, but now the white queen is ready to enter, attack the pawn on d6. Black was trying to counterattack the e4 pawn. White doesn't need to rush, but simply could protect it. The game continued with knight d3, and white is going for more than just grabbing the pawn and giving black a little bit of time to recover, and played queen c7. Now the black queen is pretty much paralyzed, stuck to the g7 square, because otherwise if the black queen would leave the defense of that square, queen g7 would be checkmate immediately. Black played b5, and white captured the pawn on a7, and black actually resigned because I guess white could simply keep pushing the a pawn and promote it, among other things. A very nice and smooth example. And now let's see a famous game by former world champion Emanuel Lasker versus one of the top players of those days, Tartakova, from the famous 1909 tournament played in St. Petersburg, Russia. Here we go. They reached this position after 42nd move of white with black's turn. Again, the experienced eye would immediately recognize that there is even material. However, black has the initiative because primarily of the weakness of the light squares around the white king. Black also has an excellently positioned knight on d3, making it difficult for white to occupy the c1 or e1 squares with his rooks. Also, the two black rooks are quite well positioned, doubled on the d file. However, with all of these good things going all for black, the big question is, how can black make progress? And as so often, even a bit similar to the previous position, where white used his h-pawn to provoke further weakness in black's position, here again, black needs to use one of his kingside pawns, in fact right in front of his own king, to provoke a weakness in white's position, and try to think what that move may be. And that move indeed is moving the pawn to g5. And this contradicts the general advice not to move your pawns that are in front of your pawn, and typically that's especially the g pawn you wouldn't want to move. However, here there is a concrete reason why black is doing that. Namely, if pawn would take pawn, then the e5 square would free up for the black knight, and that could be followed up by the knight appearing on f3. And white could only temporarily prevent that by playing rook c3, because black would follow up with rook d3 with a winning attack. White in the actual game after g5 did not capture the pawn, but played queen a2. The problem with that is that now black simply wins a pawn. The game lasted a few more moves. White played rook e2, and now black simply retreated to g6, pinning white's pawn on g3. Came queen c2, and now black, little by little, improves his position. White at the same time does not have a real active plan. Came rook g8, putting further pressure on that g3 pawn. And white moved out of the pin. Came queen h5, attacking the rook and threatening to appear on f3 at a good moment. Rook d2, and now the problem is also that the white pawn on h2 is pinned and is unable to capture back on g3 right now or on the following move. White is in serious trouble now and resides in just a couple of more moves. Let's move on to another famous game that was played by the famous Akiba Rubinstein, who is very well known for being one of the best endgame players of his era, and black was Spillman, who was one of the best attacking players of his time. And this is being played in 1912, that is, it's almost 100 years ago. We can see again that there is material balance, and we can also see that black has lost the right to castle. However, on the side that favors black is that black has a pair of bishops and a very active position. Also, the black king cannot really be attacked because the king will just go to a natural g7 square if needed sometime in the near future. And moreover, black is able to use the still undeveloped rook on h8 to his advantage to try to develop an attack along the h file. Similarly to our previous two positions, again, black is using a side pawn on the king's side to provoke weakening in the opponent's position. And black in this position continued by h3. If white would trade on h3, it's quite obvious that black would achieve quite significant improvement in his position because the rook would capture back. And without wasting any time with the rook as of castling and then putting a rook on an open file, the rook immediately appears in an excellent position, which can be followed up by doubling with the second rook eventually, or with the black queen also appearing on h4. Logically, white is trying to keep that h file closed so that black rook, even without wasting any time, doesn't get activated. If white would try to play g4, which wouldn't be a bad idea if it wouldn't lose tactically. And again, I keep reminding you over and over and over, keep in mind that when there are pieces on unprotected squares, that very oftentimes becomes the source of trouble. And that's the case here as well. Because of that, black can ignore the threat to his bishop and play queen h4, attack that rook, as well as the pawn on g4. White, instead of playing g4, responded with g3. So what did black achieve with this last pair of pawn moves? Black achieved something very important, namely the weakening of the light squares in white's camp, especially around the white king. As you can see, white already traded off his light squared bishops, while black still has his. And that's a very serious advantage, and that means that white will have to be extremely careful making sure that black bishop doesn't end up on that same diagonal with the white king. In the meantime, black needs to improve his position and get his pieces in more ideal positions than they already are. The next move was queen d7, which on one hand activates the queen and also opens the 8th rank for the black rook in the corner to come into play a bit later. White played bishop to d2, and the response was bishop g4, attacking the queen. Here White's best answer was Queen d3, preventing the black queen in getting closer to the white king. Queen f1, which White responded with, is a bit passive and is clearly inferior to Queen d3. Now the black queen is getting closer to the action. The black queen is in fact aiming to the c2 square to move in and have a double attack on the white bishop and pawn on b2. That explains White's next move, rook a to c1, preventing the arrival of the queen on c2. And Black has the time to simply improve his position by playing king g7. The reason why this move is important, because now Black is ready to bring one of his rooks to the e-file and oppose the white rook that occupies that file for now. After king g7, White played bishop e3, a very logical move, trying to trade off that annoying bishop on d4. Of course, Black says, "Thank you, but no thank you." Bishop retreated to f6. And White played b3, protecting the pawn on c4, and the response to that was rook h to e8. Now Black's plan is to double up the rooks on the e-file, putting pressure on White. White wanted to prevent that and played bishop to f2. And now the black bishop is finally able to come in to that f3 square. King moved to g1 and bishop g2. Now the white queen is kind of trapped, but White had still hopes in trading rooks, and if the rook captures back, the white queen is free to escape on d1. But Black captured the queen instead, and White captured a second rook. Typically speaking, two rooks match up with a queen. However, in this case, Black's attack is too strong and too immediate. Black can afford not to move his bishop away and waste time with that, but bring the queen immediately to the attack, because now, if the white rook captures the bishop on f1, the black queen appears on f3, and with the help of the h3 pawn, creates an undefendable checkmate threat on g2. The game continued by White playing rook e8, trying to bring the rook back to the defense, and now Black has a very nice way to push the issue and play queen f3, giving up on the bishop on f1, and the idea was to play queen h1 check. If now the king would move out, then the rook on c1 is hanging, so White tried to block the check for the time being. And now comes queen g2, when White needs to move away from the bishop, give it up. And White's position is quite hopeless. In fact, White resigned in this position. There is a cute idea that I'd like to point out though, namely that after knight e2, White would lose, because after queen g2, which opens up the road for the h-pawn to become a queen, now after rook g1, Black has a beautiful combination which is much better than just moving the queen away, namely queen takes rook. And beautifully, White cannot stop the promotion of the h-pawn. Let's move on to one more example on this theme. This is also a game by a famous grandmaster, Yefim Geller, against Bolbohan at the 1962 interzonal tournament played in Sweden. In this position, it's quite clear that black has a target, a weakness, namely the backward pawn on d6. What white would like to do is to put a piece on d5 other than a pawn, any other piece, but ideally a knight. White would want to have a knight on d5. You may say, but white can do that right away, which is very true, but the problem with that is that black will be able to trade on d5 and force a white pawn there. And the problem with that is that now the d6 pawn is no longer a weakness. So therefore, white would like to avoid that. So white would like to have a piece on d5 at the time that when if black captures that, a second knight or a second piece could occupy that square, anything but a pawn. So what white would like to do is to get his knight from c1 to b4 and then to d5. If white goes through the natural route by playing knight d3, the problem is that it allows all of a sudden black to liberate himself by playing d5 and trade off that weakness, the d6 pawn, for white's e4 pawn, and black would be in a tip-top shape. Therefore, the correct route is, on the other hand, moving the knight to a2. The idea is the same, trying to get to b4. And now the game continued with knight c5, knight b4, a5, and knight d5. Black traded, white takes not with the pawn, but with the knight, and queen takes, and each opportunity white gets, white does not take with the pawn, but with a different piece. And now white achieved the goal by getting full control of the d5 square, and even though the game went on for a long time, white improved clearly his position from our starting position. We'll get to those technical details at another lesson. And now, for entertainment and learning, of course, let's see the brilliant position of the week. Here we go. In this position, black has a queen, and as compensation, white has a bishop, a knight, and 2 pawns. Nevertheless, that gives black material advantage. I suggest you pause this lesson and set up the position on the board if you wish, and try to figure out the correct solution. How can white win this game? Amazingly, the solution lies in creating a zugzwang for black, which is quite shocking because the black queen is completely centralized and seems to have a lot of different squares to his disposal. The correct solution is playing b6. And now, other than moving the queen, the only other option is to push the pawn. And in that case, white just makes another evading move. And now, amazingly, black, anywhere he goes with the queen, will lose the queen after 2 checks. Before you check it out, my solution, why don't you try to figure out all the different forks on your own? By the way, this composition was created by the famous composer Ring in 1935. For example, if the queen moves to b8, the check comes from f6, followed by knight d7. Or if the queen goes, for example, from e5 to e1, the knight would move to f4 and then to d3. And you can figure out by yourself all the other queen moves would also result with a fork in 2 moves. Well, hope you enjoyed this beautiful endgame, and as well, of course, as the rest of the examples that we saw on how to create weaknesses in your opponent's position. Thank you for being here and listening today. So long until next week.